Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we were looking at the development of the university system in Western civilization and noting that the Catholic Church played a larger role than any other institution in spreading knowledge, cultivating the pursuit of knowledge, and allowing the university system to blossom. There was no institution that did more, and the papacy in particular consistently intervened. Now, right away, as early as the 1200s, as the universities are forming, we already see the characteristics of modern universities. They were not absolutely identical to our modern universities, but we see important similarities. For instance, that we had the same distinction between graduate and undergraduate education that we have now. We had the idea that you go and you pursue a fixed course of study, upon the completion of which you receive a degree. All these things were features of the medieval university. Now, in the ancient world, they had schools, of course, they had academies, but they didn't have quite these features that I've described. And typically, if you belonged to an ancient academy, it meant that you belonged to the school of thought that dominated that academy. Whereas in the medieval university, there was no reigning school of thought. Instead, you had vigorous debate back and forth on a variety of subjects. But just before we went to the break, I specifically pointed to the role of the popes. How did the popes help to foster the universities, apart from chartering more universities than anybody? The popes also extended the benefit of clergy to students. Benefit of clergy is a privilege that was extended typically, of course, to clergymen, which said that if you were to harm a clergyman, it would be considered an especially heinous offense. Also, benefit of clergy meant that if you were a clergyman, you could have your case heard in a church court rather than a local secular court. Well, this benefit was extended to the students at universities because, as I suggested at the break, sometimes the local townspeople didn't really like the students, just the way they are today. A lot of people today look at the university students and they say, I like the fact that they've brought mom and dad's money to my town and they're ready to spend it on all kinds of ridiculous nonsense. However, I don't like the fact that they keep knocking over my mailbox. I mean, why would you get pleasure out of knocking over my mailbox? This sort of thing. People love the money and they hate the students. That's exactly how they felt in the Middle Ages. So sometimes the students would find themselves being hauled into some local court on trumped-up charges and just being harassed in general. The Pope prevented that from happening and allowed the life of the university to flourish by extending benefit of clergy to the students. Anytime there was any need to intervene in the university system, if there was some kind of problem, people knew you appeal to the Pope and he will resolve it. In fact, on numerous occasions, the Pope had to intervene to ensure that the professors' salaries were being paid. Now think of how pro-Catholic European universities would be today if Pope Benedict could do that, if he could intervene and get them a raise or something. Well, anyway, those days are gone. However, it is important to recognize that among the universities that were chartered by the Pope, there was something called, in Latin, and I'm using the church pronunciation, ius ubique docendi, which literally means the right of teaching everywhere. What that means is that if you got a degree at a university that the Pope had founded, had given its charter to, that you had the right, automatically, no questions asked, to go to any university in Western Europe and begin teaching. No questions asked. So that begins to foster the idea of an international scholarly community, because somebody coming from this university can just go and teach over at this one. And we begin to get fruitful intellectual exchange. Now, some people, I'm sure, have a sort of caricatured view of what intellectual life must have been like in a medieval university because, for instance, it's sometimes said that, oh, of course we had universities, but the professors had to toe the line, right? They had to say whatever the bishop wanted them to say, or the Pope, or they were always hemmed in and they couldn't just say what they wanted to say. That is so false that it would take forever to refute it. To the contrary, as any impartial historian of the universities will tell you, to the contrary, the intellectual life of these universities was very vigorous and robust. There was hardly any question that was not rigorously debated at the medieval university. Now, it's true, there were broad theological limits within which this debate took place, but within those limits, it was open season for various questions being debated. I mean, arguably, there was more rigorous debate in medieval universities than there are when we see in universities today. I mean, in universities today, we all know you have to walk on eggshells, you're not allowed to say certain things, or you're not allowed to defend certain types of people or defend the Catholic Church. We all know that. You didn't have that in the medieval university. You had rigorous, vigorous debate going on back and forth. In fact, what you would see in the afternoons after the professors would give their morning lectures was that a professor would get up before the entire assembled university community, and he would do something called determine a question. That is to say, some controversial question would be debated by skilled debaters on both sides of that matter. And they would both make the strongest cases they could for their own positions. And then it would be up to the professor to step forward and synthesize everything that had just been heard and put it all together and resolve it, come to a solution on the basis of this rigorous debate. That was called determining a question, and that took place in the afternoons. Now, I would like to see a modern university try something like that, but you won't see it because the professors are all tenured and they want to just sit in their offices and type entries on their blog, so they're not going to want to do that. But that was what the university system was like, and if you wanted to get a degree in a medieval university, you had to do that too. You as a student had to stand up there in front of the whole university community and determine a question. That's hard. That's difficult. Now consider also that we can see the debating nature of our Western civilization. We can see it evident in the writings of this time, the writings of the early centuries of the university. Take, for example, the great St. Thomas Aquinas, who is admired by all civilized people everywhere, in effect. Look at St. Thomas. Look at the way he debated with people. First of all, if you look at his Summa Theologiae, or Summa Theologica, you see that it's arranged according to questions and answers. Thousands of questions he raises. Incidentally, I used to put on my quizzes, yes, I'm admitting on camera that I gave multiple choice quizzes at the college level. I did that just to make sure they read their books, which they didn't, but I gave them the quizzes all the same. And one of the wrong answers I gave was, the church told people not to ask questions. Now, if you were even slightly listening to anything I was saying, there's no way you'd circle that answer. You wouldn't believe how many of them would circle it. I could have spent the whole semester standing up there saying the church fostered a culture in which questions were routinely asked. Wouldn't have made any difference. They've already been told the church hates knowledge. And so they all circled the wrong answer. Well, in any event, St. Thomas Aquinas asked question after question after question. And if you notice the style of his writing, you notice the organization of it, he and other scholastics debated things in this way. They would take some question, and then they would consider all the possible objections to their own position and list them out. And then they would explain their own position. And then they'd go back and they'd answer the objections. And he did this for question after question after question. It's an extraordinary achievement. It's fascinating reading. And what's great about it is that St. Thomas was generous toward his opponents. St. Thomas wouldn't just make up some ridiculous argument, attribute it to his opponents, and then say, aha, I triumphantly answer this person. No, he would present his opponent's arguments as persuasively as he could. At least try to make it a little interesting, right? He would portray it as accurately as possible and as persuasively as possible. In fact, in some cases, St. Thomas would even think up arguments that his own opponents hadn't even thought of. And he would say, well, wait a minute, you guys also have this argument and this one. I'll give you those, and then he'd answer those. I mean, that is an honest debater. That's what Western intellectual life was like, and you see it in St. Thomas. It's organized in effect, the format of a debate, an ongoing debate with antagonists. That is an extraordinary achievement. That is what our Western civilization is about. It's not just uniformity, it's debate and discussion. Now, one of the great historians of science in our day is a man named Edward Grant. And he looked back at these medieval universities not long ago, and he found something very, very important there. And he said this, he said, what made it possible for Western civilization to develop science and the social sciences in a way that no other civilization had ever done before? The answer, I am convinced, lies in a pervasive and deep-seated spirit of inquiry that was a natural consequence of the emphasis on reason that began in the Middle Ages. With the exception of revealed truths, reason was enthroned in medieval universities as the ultimate arbiter for most intellectual arguments and controversies. It was quite natural for scholars immersed in a university environment to employ reason, to probe into subject areas that had not been explored before, as well as to discuss possibilities that had not previously been seriously entertained. And Professor Grant went on to say that the commitment to reason and rational discussion that we see in the Middle Ages and that we see in our modern world, this is one of the great gifts of the Latin Middle Ages to our world. But nobody knows about it. And he said it must, unfortunately, remain one of the best-kept secrets of the past hundreds of years. Isn't that astonishing? We shouldn't keep it a secret, however. We should go around telling people about this, because it's an extraordinary aspect of our civilization. Let's just end with St. Anselm, for example, is another example of what I'm talking about. St. Anselm, although he lived just before the universities were getting started, but he had the same spirit of rational inquiry. St. Anselm, for instance, had a book in Latin, Cur Deus Homo, which has been usually rendered in English as Why the God-Man, or Why Did God Become Man? Because St. Anselm used purely rational argument to try to consider, why did God do the extraordinary? Why did he become man and dwell among us? If he wished to reconcile the human race to himself, why did he not simply make a declaration from heaven? Why did he become man? And St. Anselm explained this by using his own reason, thinking about it. But what St. Anselm is known for the most, perhaps, among philosophers, is that he asked another rational question: does God exist? And he began to use reason to try to uncover the answer to that question. Does God exist? St. Thomas picked up this question, of course, and he had 5 ways that he used to demonstrate that God existed. And this is where we're going to pick up next time, because this intellectual tradition of debate and discussion and reason turns itself on the faith itself and asks questions like, does God exist? And if so, can we demonstrate it? And I'm going to suggest that they did it. How did they do it? We'll see next time on The Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.